You're listening to Speaking Of by WFSU Public Media. Refuge House has been providing emergency shelter services and attempting to aid victims of domestic and sexual violence for over 45 years. But recently, the center has been forced to turn away some of those seeking help. WFSU reporter Margie Menzel is discussing the situation with TSC professor Iris Davis Pendleton, who previously sought help from the center, Leon County undersheriff Ron Caves, who details his upbringing in the foster care system, and more.
Hi, I'm Gina Jordan, a host at WFSU Public Media, and today we are speaking of the Refuge House. It's in the midst of a capital campaign as it seeks to stop having to turn victims away.
July 25th, 2020 is when I was physically attacked in front of my children. And because I had months before that where I had really been starting to process and learn more about what was happening, I was finally ready to leave.
Iris Davis Pendleton has a PhD, and she's the faculty lead for the Early Childhood Education program at Tallahassee State College. But first, she went down an ugly road of domestic abuse. At 19, she met a man twice her age. They had 2 children and stayed together almost 2 decades.
I actually went to a counseling session at the Refuge House, and I didn't go to their counseling very long because some of the things the lady said to me really scared me. Like she said, I hear that you're concerned about him and you want to help him, but have you considered getting yourself and your children to safety and helping him from a distance? And I remember her telling me about, looking in the mirror every day and telling myself I'm beautiful. And I remember saying, what if I don't believe it? Because again, my self-esteem was in the garbage. But that day, talking to that lady really started me on a journey. I started keeping a journal in 2019, and I would write in it every day about what I was experiencing, just about life in general. And by 2020, during COVID, that's when I left.
WFSU reporter Margie Menzel spoke with Iris and others for this segment. Margie, welcome.
Hi, Gina. Yeah, Iris is really inspiring. She was on this year's list of the Tallahassee Democrats' 25 Women You Need to Know. She's done quite well in spite of her situation with her ex. And her children are doing well, too. She gives some of the credit to Refuge House.
And so going to that counseling session, I wish I remembered the lady's name. She was so kind. She was so compassionate. And just her helping me think about the life that I was living, but also thinking about the life I wanted to live. So she did let me know, yes, you can love someone, but you can love them from a distance. You can support them, but you can support them from a distance. Because I was very much worried about what would happen to the other person if I left. But I wasn't worrying enough about what would happen to me if I didn't leave and what could potentially happen to the children. And so she was really trying to put me on that path.
Refuge House helps victims of domestic violence and sexual assault and their families in 8 Big Bend counties, including Leon. And they need help. Desperate victims are calling Refuge House and being told there isn't enough housing for them. I spoke with Leon County Undersheriff Ron Caves about what we're seeing locally.
We definitely are seeing an uptick in domestic violence-related incidences. And then, unfortunately, we saw an uptick last year with domestic-related homicides.
He says just under 500 incidents were reported in 2022, and that steadily rose to nearly 750 incidents last year. We already have around 200 reports of domestic violence so far this year in Leon.
And what does he say about the uptick in cases?
He says many factors have contributed. Substance abuse, COVID-related issues, stress. In his family, alcohol triggered violence. It's really hard to quantify or say the actual causes of domestic violence, although we know a child who sees it or experiences it is likely to become a victim or perpetrator.
Well, yeah. And we'll hear more from Ron Caves about his personal experience with domestic violence. You also talked with Emily Mitchum about the various factors that could be at play here.
Yes, Emily is the executive director of Refuge House. She says we're learning more about the impact of domestic violence over generations. But also, we need to find a way to start reaching more people who've been affected. And it's a problem right now because Refuge House and places like it are struggling to keep up with the need. I asked her about it. I've never been able to shake the memory of something you said, which is that the hardest job at Refuge House belongs to the people who answer the hotline
Yes.
and have to tell somebody there's no room for them.
Yes. Yes. Our assistant director, the program director of the hotlines, and the advocates, they deal with stories that are just heart-wrenching, and there's no solution. You come to a job and you want to make a difference and you want to help, and then you get in there and discover that the resources are so limited, that so many of those people who are asking you for help, you can't provide it. And so they navigate angry third parties, which is understandable. You've got a nurse at TMH that says, I'm fixing to have to release her from the hospital. She's got nowhere to go but back. And there's no room. There's no bed space at Refuge House. We can't do anything. And so those are just really difficult calls. They're really, the housing, there's no solution for it. And everything is, with every benefit of, oh, well, maybe you can go stay at, this place or that place, there's a risk factor that pops up. So it's just very frustrating. It's a hard job. They're unsung heroes. They take a lot of hard calls and difficult conversations, and they push through it the best they can with the resources that are available.
Right now, you're in the middle of a capital campaign to expand the shelter, expand the program.
We have noticed over the past few years, probably the past 10 years, and it kind of shifted during COVID, but then sort of returned to the new normal of more and more and more people that are reaching out needing emergency shelter. And our Leon County shelter is relatively small. There's a wing of it that's dedicated to transitional housing. It's longer term. But the emergency shelter portion is only about 23 beds. So that's serving 6 of our 8 counties that we are in here in the Big Bend. So we're woefully undersized for the population we serve.
Now, we have talked relatively recently about the stats for y'all turning away 100 people, roughly 100 people a month.
Yes, about 3 years ago, I started really wanting to see the number. What is what does it mean that we're always full? I'm constantly getting phone calls from law enforcement. I've got a victim and she has nowhere to go, and I've called the hotline and they say you're full. And so I wanted to know what is our number that we are not able to serve? And it's roughly at least 100 every month that we're having to turn away because we can't bring them in. We don't have enough space. And that leaves these women and children with the option of either staying in an abusive relationship or entering homelessness, where they're more likely to become victimized again. So it's a really kind of a hopeless cycle that we're in, and that's why we're looking to expand.
You need more beds.
We need more space, more beds, and we need a different approach to the cycle of family violence that we unfortunately see. I was looking 3 years ago, okay, what can we do? And we have on our property an existing building that's not being utilized anymore because we lost funding for the program that it was. So I started looking at that and thinking, well, we could renovate this and squeeze in maybe, 15, 20 beds. At that same time, I started really talking to and listening to our staff in the shelter and our shelter manager and our brilliant assistant director, and saying, am I wrong, or are we just not really meeting the needs of today's survivors? Because it seems like this model that came about 40 years ago, it just doesn't seem like it's adequate anymore. And the reason I say that is because if we have a mom come in today with a 13-year-old daughter, and 10 years down the road, that 13-year-old daughter's in our shelter with a baby on her hip, something didn't work. There's some cracks that these people have slipped through, and we need to see what we can do to solve or remedy those cracks in the system so that they have better outcomes long term.
But we do know that violence is intergenerational.
Absolutely, yes. And so that's what we're seeing. The original model, which is fantastic for emergency shelter, we want people to come in, get on their feet, and get going as soon as possible. But for some, they need more time. And there needs to be more resources placed on the children so that we can build up their resilience, heal the trauma that they have absorbed either by witnessing the violence or having been a victim to it themselves, which most of our kids have also been abused. And so there needs to be something, a different approach, a different model. And so we've come up with, we call it a multi-generation approach, that if it's grandma, daughter, and granddaughter, then we want all three of those people to have really good resources to be able to break that cycle of violence, to get economically self-sufficient, to get into safe long-term permanent housing so that they're not vulnerable to further victimization, especially not the kids. We want to really try some different things with this approach to breaking that cycle of violence. We want everyone set up for the best success possible.
Can we talk about human trafficking? I know that it's an issue at the shelter.
Yes.
It seems as if people have become more aware that it is connected to domestic violence.
Yes. What happens is that victims will come to us, they'll call us on the hotline and say, my boyfriend's beating me up, I've got to get away from him. So we bring them in. And then over the course of just building a little bit of rapport over a few days, we hear the story and realize, no, this isn't boyfriend, this is a trafficker, and this is trafficking, and yes, there's domestic violence because he's obviously beating her, but there's a different dynamic. And so trafficking victims, they do need a little bit different care. Their needs are a little bit different than domestic violence. So we have a small section of our programming, because our funding is small for this portion of our programming, set aside for sex trafficking victims. But they will also be welcome in the new program because so much of the violence against women, it does not exist in silos. It's all interconnected. It's not, I was just raped and I was just a victim of domestic violence and I was just a trafficking victim. There are multiple victimization types for most of our clients. So we try to make sure we have something for everybody and that our staff are trained to deal with all of the co-occurring issues that they may be facing. And that'll be true in the new program also.
So, Margie, we still have a critical need for affordable and safe housing for domestic violence and trafficking survivors.
And it is statewide, Gina. So that's why I spoke with Amanda Price. She's the executive director of the Florida Partnership to End Domestic Violence.
Yeah, that's one of the most difficult and challenging aspects of shelter work is there's only a certain number of beds in every shelter. And shelters are not just a getaway. They are an emergency crisis service. People show up or can be transported by law enforcement to a shelter at 3 a.m. They can show up at any time of the day. They can be alone or can have, 4 or 5 children with them. They could have a pet with them. And they usually don't have any other options, and often they are in a fight for their actual life. This is a life or death situation. And if they show up at the shelter and the shelter does not have the ability to provide a bed for them, the shelter is very scrappy and they will work with every partner that they have throughout Leon County to find a solution to ensure that that family has a safe place to go. But if there's not a bed available that can accommodate, for example, 3 or 4 children or a child with a specific disability or a pet that is important to the family, that family would have no other option in terms of where they might go. They are at the shelter as a last resort. So if the shelter cannot help them, they don't have any other options. And that can often mean sleeping in one's car or finding somewhere on the street.
I'm listening to that and I'm thinking, I can only imagine the impact on the kids.
She says the circumstances can be life-altering. And so the situation that puts the providers in is they have to meet the immediate need, and they're not really able to look long-term.
Where we have opportunity to improve as a system is acknowledging what those children are going to experience the rest of their lives as a result of their exposure to this violent incident. The impact on those kids is not just in the moment, but we know it is a researched, proven scientific fact that the more bad things that happen to a child, the higher the likelihood of bad things happening to that person as an adult. So as the child is exposed to violence and unhomed, that is a number of adverse experiences. We might help them in that moment, but what we as a system are not doing very well is making sure that we are supporting that child as they grow. We know that that child is very likely to either be re-victimized or even turn into someone who has perpetrated violence, and yet we are not addressing that. It is just an immeasurable impact to a growing child to be a victim of violence.
So for adults who endured these violent situations as children, Price says studies show a link with substance abuse, mental health, as well as an increased likelihood of diabetes, heart trouble, all kinds of health problems. She says this becomes a generational problem within families, and that is something that needs a lot more attention.
We're not really talking about what happens every day. We're not talking about the fact that 106,000 people sought emergency shelter last year. We're not talking about the fact that people are showing up to seek life-saving assistance at shelters and the shelters are full and not able to meet the needs of that person. And we're then not talking about what happens next year or in 5 years or 10 years to that family and how we're going to, as a system, be responding to that family in the future. So we should be talking about it generationally.
Gina, that's over 100,000 people just in Florida that needed emergency help last year to escape an abusive situation. It could be anybody. It cuts across every demographic.
Yeah, and it absolutely does. And I think we have a great example of that in Leon Undersheriff Ron Cave. Not only has he responded to these cases, but he experienced domestic violence in his childhood.
Yes, he talked to me about how he grew up in a violent household. His experience was a home where domestic violence was a part of life. He was told to lie about what happened to cause his injuries. Fortunately, police intervened, and he says that ultimately saved him and also helped him to become a better law enforcement officer.
I actually had some physical abuse that took me to the hospital, and I was told to tell a story as to what happened. And I did. I just apparently was not a good liar. And officers came to the hospital and interviewed me and was able to ask me what happened, and I shared that with them. And so, when I teach basic recruit curriculum, for example, these are the people that's in the police academy, I tell them, folks, you're seeing and interacting with people perhaps at their worst time in their life. Your interaction and how you handle and deal with them has a potential to have a lifelong impact on them. And that's the case with me, as this one interaction with this officer had an impact where it's like, hey, he helped me, I can help people and have a positive impact on persons. So it absolutely was positive for me, and I try to share that with others too.
That's amazing. It's amazing that he came out of that so well.
He went to live with a foster family. He says he was only with them for 2 years before he was sent back to his mother, but his foster mother had a huge positive impact on him.
I believe that positive intervention is so very important, because here my foster mother engaged me in sports, basketball, baseball, which I'd never had, brought me into church environment, showed me a stable, home. Even though I got placed back with my mother, I had that foundation early, and that made, from my perspective, I think, a tremendous difference.
Ron Cave went on to have an incredible life. He got into the Air Force ROTC program at Godby. He says he had good mentors, and he went on to get multiple master's degrees.
That's amazing. That's a lot of work, and he does have an extremely impressive resume.
He is amazing. And he's been one of those law enforcers who's connected domestic violence victims with Refuge House. I asked him to describe children on the scene, where a law enforcement officer responds to a domestic violence report in real time.
They're terrified. They're terrified. You have strangers in your house, because oftentimes it's multiple law enforcement, sometimes EMS, sometimes fire, so you have a lot. So they're terrified. They're embarrassed. Again, I remember being so embarrassed that my family couldn't get along and that they were, just alcoholics. And it's like, so you don't understand. You have a hard time processing that. But I would say just terrified, because you're terrified of what's going to happen to your mom or your dad. Are they going to be arrested? Are they going to be taken away? Or somebody going to go to the hospital? There's so many range of emotions that's going on that you just trying to comprehend it, especially at a young age, is really tough.
Ron Cave says that without Refuge House, law enforcement would be substantially less effective in addressing victims' needs, especially children.
Getting kids to open up and share and explain what's happening and what has happened, and trying to get them the help that they need, because they also have long-term residual impacts from seeing and or being victims themselves of domestic violence.
One thing that happens is that the kids shut down. And if they don't get help, like counseling, these kids are more likely to have anxiety, depression, PTSD. They're more likely to have very negative outcomes.
Yeah. Well, Margie, we need to wrap up this discussion. It's been enlightening. What can any of us do?
Don't ignore it. If you're concerned, ask the person if she or he needs help. Professor Pendleton, who we heard from in the beginning, says much of the reason she thought domestic violence was normal is that she saw it among her neighbors growing up. And no one said a thing. She learned not to say anything either until she got counseling from Refuge House.
At the time, I was very ashamed about what I was going through. I didn't want people to know that I was in an abusive relationship. Now I talk to people about it, but at the time I was ashamed. And I've met many other people who don't want people to know this publicly. And so knowing that the services are anonymous, knowing that they have very well-trained staff. In the past, I even called the hotline, and because sometimes I would just need somebody to talk to about what I was going through, and they would just listen, and they wouldn't tell anyone. They would not judge. They just listened with kindness and compassion. And that's something that I will forever appreciate. And I think people need to know that, because I didn't need the shelter when I left to get to safety. When I left the abuser back in 2020, I was able to get a hotel, get safe until, the police could remove him from the home. But there were those other services like the counseling, like the hotline, that I found to be very helpful.
She really has an incredible story.
She's amazing.
Yeah.
People can help by volunteering at places like Refuge House or donating items like clothes and toys. And in the meantime, the Refuge House Capital Campaign is happening, and we have more information about that at WFSU.org.
Excellent. WFSU reporter Margie Menzel, thank you so much for your reporting on this.
Thank you for shining a light, Gina.
Just tuning in, you can now hear these conversations on Speaking Of, the podcast version, available on all platforms.